They said he was overreacting, that he was wasting the court's time, that no real harm had been done. From the moment Daniel stepped into the courtroom, the odds were against him. A man in his late 30s wearing a second-hand suit and carrying a folder of documents, he looked more like a student fighting a parking ticket than someone bringing forth a lawsuit that would shake a legal system to its core. When he filed his case, the clerk barely glanced at it before offering a polite smile, the kind that doesn't touch the eyes. The judge reviewing the preliminary documents apparently chuckled during the conference, reportedly telling his clerk, "We get all kinds." What they didn't see, what they didn't bother to ask, was what Daniel had lived through. The humiliation, the abuse, the sleepless nights. The invisible scars left by a moment that the world would call minor, but that had changed everything for him. It started in a hardware store, a small, family-run place that had been around for decades. Daniel had gone in to return a defective power tool he bought just a week earlier. He had the receipt, the packaging, everything. But the clerk behind the counter didn't want to deal with it. Instead, he called over the manager, and that's when things went sideways. What should have been a 2-minute return turned into a confrontation. The manager accused Daniel of theft. The store security guard, acting on nothing but suspicion, physically restrained him. They dragged him to the back room, no police, no rights, no dignity, just accusations, just hands on his chest, forcing him down, threatening him. They took his phone. They searched his backpack. They released him 2 hours later without an apology. No charges were filed because none existed. No report was written because there was nothing to report. But the damage had been done. Daniel left that store, not just shaken, but shattered, and the world didn't care. Friends said, "Let it go." His boss said, "Be grateful it wasn't worse." Even his own brother told him, "Don't stir up trouble." But Daniel couldn't sleep. He kept hearing the words, the accusations. He kept feeling the grip of the guard's hands, the manager's sneer, the quiet approval from a cashier who didn't say a word in his defense. Then he remembered the old dash cam he had forgotten was still in his bag. Not a car cam, but one of those personal video recorders he used while biking, left recording accidentally. He pulled it up, and there it was, clear as day, everything, the words, the actions, the abuse, caught. From the moment he walked in to the second he walked out, it was all there. He watched the footage again and again, not because he needed to, but because part of him still couldn't believe it. He filed the lawsuit, not because he wanted money, but because he needed someone to admit this wasn't okay. But in that courtroom, his truth was treated like a punchline until the video played. It was the third day of hearings when he asked to submit evidence. The opposing counsel scoffed. "A video?" the manager said under his breath, smirking. The judge raised an eyebrow but waved for it to proceed. And then silence. The room went still. Every smirk vanished. What unfolded on screen was undeniable. The aggression, the baseless accusations, the rough handling, the complete disregard for Daniel's rights. When the video ended, no one laughed, not even the judge. What followed wasn't dramatic. No gavel, pounding, no shouting, just the sound of a shifted reality. One man's pain finally seen for what it truly was. The jury deliberated for 3 hours. They returned with a verdict that not only awarded Daniel damages, but delivered a written rebuke to the store and its management. A precedent was set. A public apology followed. Policies changed. Cameras were installed. Employees trained. But Daniel didn't smile. He walked out of that courtroom exhausted, not because he lost, but because he had carried the weight of a story no one wanted to hear until the evidence forced them to listen. On his way out, a young woman in the hallway, a legal intern, stopped him. "Thank you," she said softly. "I'm going to remember this. I'm going to remember that sometimes one person standing up can make the system sit down." That night, Daniel sat at his kitchen table, drinking tea from a chipped mug. He didn't feel victorious. He felt something else, something quieter. He felt whole again, not because the world had fixed what was broken, but because he had chosen not to remain silent. He had taken pain and turned it into purpose, and in doing so, he had reminded us all, courage isn't always loud. Justice isn't always swift, but truth, when shown, when truly seen, has the power to change everything. In the weeks that followed, Daniel became somewhat of a local figure. Journalists reached out, his story circulated on social media, and hashtags popped up calling for accountability and reform. But Daniel remained quiet. He didn't do interviews, he didn't chase cameras. Instead, he went back to work, to his routines, to his quiet life. But something fundamental had shifted within him. He had once believed that the system didn't care about people like him, people without power, without connections. And maybe in many ways that was still true. But now he knew this. The truth, when documented, when undeniable, was its own force. A quiet force. A slow-moving, deeply patient one. But a force nonetheless. He still carried the scar of that day. Not physical, but emotional. He couldn't walk into a store without his chest tightening. Couldn't stand in line without wondering if someone was watching him a little too closely. But he also carried something else now. A sense of dignity that hadn't been given to him by the court or by the verdict or by the jury. It was something he had given himself. In standing up, in fighting back, in refusing to disappear, Daniel had redefined what justice looked like for himself. There was a particular day, a month, after the verdict that stayed with him. He had gone to the grocery store, something that had become more difficult than he'd ever expected. He was standing in the checkout line, hands in his pockets, when a boy, maybe 12, looked up at him and said, "You're the man from the video." Daniel turned, surprised. The boy's mother looked flustered, apologetic. "I'm sorry, we saw your story on the news. He's just—" Daniel smiled. "It's all right," the boy asked. "Were you scared?" He paused before answering. "Yes," he said quietly. "But being scared doesn't mean you're weak. It just means you're human." The boy nodded like he understood something far bigger than his age should allow. And Daniel walked out that day feeling something close to peace. Back home, he finally opened the envelope that had been sitting on his kitchen counter for days. The official copy of the court's findings. There was something striking about seeing it in writing. The facts laid bare, the judgment rendered. But even more powerful was the handwritten note clipped inside. It was from a juror. No name, just a few sentences. "I came into that room thinking this case was a waste of time. You showed me what dignity looks like, what perseverance is. Thank you for not giving up. You made me believe again." Daniel read those words over and over, tears welling in his eyes. Not because he needed validation, but because it meant someone had truly seen him. Not just the footage, but him. The man behind the video. The man who refused to be forgotten. There's something powerful that happens when a person chooses integrity over comfort. When someone walks through fire not to win but to say, "I matter. What happened mattered, and it should never happen again." Daniel didn't become an activist. He didn't start a movement. But he became a symbol, not of resistance, but of resilience. Months later, the store quietly settled another lawsuit, this time before it ever reached a courtroom. Policies had changed, staff had been trained, and Daniel's video, grainy and imperfect, had become part of a training manual for how not to treat customers. Change had come. Not fast, not loud, but real. And Daniel? He had gone back to riding his bike, filming his roots again. Sometimes he'd stop and sit on a bench near the courthouse, not out of bitterness, not even out of reflection, but to remind himself that he didn't just survive. He stood up, and the world had to sit down and listen. In the quiet space of his life, he found something far louder than the courtroom's verdict. He found peace. It wasn't long before Daniel began receiving letters, dozens at first, then hundreds, handwritten notes, emails, messages left at the small bakery where he worked part-time. Some came from strangers who had seen the story online and wanted to thank him. Others were from people who had been through something similar, but never had. The chance or the courage to speak up. They wrote about fear, about shame, about the long silence that follows humiliation. They told Daniel that seeing him stand firm in court had given them the strength to reclaim their own dignity. And Daniel read every single one. One message, from a retired schoolteacher in Georgia, struck him deeply. It said, "My son was in your shoes 20 years ago. He didn't survive it. When I saw your face on the screen, I thought of him. I imagined what it would have been like if he had lived to fight back. You made me cry. And for the first time in years, it wasn't just doubt. So of grief, it was hope. Daniel folded that message and placed it in a small wooden box next to his bed. He began journaling again. Quiet thoughts at first, a single sentence here and there, nothing grand. But eventually they turned into reflections, personal truths. He wrote about the moment the cuffs clicked around his wrists, about how humiliation doesn't hit all at once but in layers, first in front of strangers, then in front of friends, and finally in front of yourself. He wrote about how healing isn't a straight line but a messy circle. You come back to the same hurt more than once, but each time you do, it stings a little less. And slowly, he started to see his pain not as an ending, but a threshold. The city, meanwhile, was changing. Not fast, not enough, but changing. The store that had wronged him was sold to new ownership. The police officer who had testified against him left the force quietly. Policy shifts were announced in a press conference nobody really watched, but Daniel did. He sat at his kitchen table, tea in hand, as the mayor read a statement that didn't mention his name but felt like it was written just for him. Today, we recommit to seeing every citizen with fairness and humanity, she said. No one should have to prove their worth to be treated with dignity. It was vague, political, and far too late, but it was something, and Daniel understood something else that day. Sometimes justice doesn't arrive like a trumpet blast. Sometimes it whispers. One Sunday afternoon, Daniel visited a local school where he had been invited to speak, not as an expert, not as a lawyer, but as someone who had been there. Just a man with a story. The classroom was quiet when he spoke. Not the kind of quiet that means boredom, but the kind that signals something sacred. He told them about the day it happened, not just the facts, but the feelings, the disbelief, the shame, the battle to prove he didn't deserve what was done to him. And then he told them about the jury, the moment the courtroom held its breath, the way the judge's expression changed when the video played, how truth had a weight to it when spoken aloud. A student raised her hand and asked, "Do you think it was worth it?" Daniel smiled. "Yes, because when you stop running from your story, it stops chasing you." That line would stay with the students for a long time. One of them, a young boy named Jalen, wrote a short essay about it that won a regional contest. In it, he said, "Sometimes the strongest thing a person can do is say that was wrong and not back down even when nobody listens at first." Jalen's teacher sent Daniel a copy of that essay, another letter for the box. Daniel never wanted to be a hero. He never asked to be a symbol. But life has a strange way of giving our pain a purpose when we least expect it. He began mentoring at-risk youth in his neighborhood, not to teach them how to stay out of trouble, but to show them what it looks like to stand up after being knocked down. He talked about self-discipline, about breathing through anger, about choosing response over reaction. He taught them what it meant to be present, not just in their lives, but in their emotions. Being mindful, he told them, doesn't mean ignoring what's wrong. It means noticing it, feeling it fully, and choosing your next step with clarity. The kids listened, not because he was flashy or loud, but because he was real, and real is rare. Eventually, Daniel found himself on a podcast, a local show hosted by a soft-spoken interviewer named Rena. She had seen the court video. Asked him if he'd be willing to talk about it. He hesitated, then said yes. "I was angry," he admitted on the show. But anger isn't the same as hate. Anger tells you something's wrong. Hate makes you think it can't ever be fixed, Rena. Asked him what he hoped people took away from his experience. He paused, that you don't need a title or power to make a difference, just truth, patience, and the decision to keep showing up. The episode went viral, not because it was dramatic, but because it was human. Because Daniel didn't play the victim or the hero. He was just honest. People found comfort in that. Later that year, a local high school named him its keynote speaker for graduation. He stood before rows of students in caps and gowns, their eyes full of hope and uncertainty. He didn't talk about the lawsuit. He talked about the moments between the moments. The early mornings when he doubted himself, the quiet nights when the world felt too loud, the choice to get up again, even when no one was clapping. "Your worth," he said, "is not up for debate. Not in a courtroom, not in a store, not anywhere. Carry it with you, like breath, like blood." And the students rose to their feet. After the speech, as the graduates filed out into the sunlit courtyard with diplomas clutched to their chests and futures blooming behind their eyes, Daniel stood off to the side. A few students came up, asked for photos. One girl hugged him without a word. Her mother had been wrongly arrested the year before. She simply whispered, "Thank you for surviving." Daniel nodded. No words needed. In the weeks that followed, a documentary filmmaker reached out. They wanted to tell his story, not sensationalized, not dramatized, just true. Daniel agreed, but on one condition. The film wouldn't be about his pain. It would be about the turning point, the moment things shifted, not because the system changed overnight, but because one person refused to accept that injustice was normal. The documentary, titled "The Footage That Changed Everything," aired nationally. Viewers across the country saw the grainy courtroom clip. They saw the judge's eyes widen. They heard the quiet gasp in the room. And they heard Daniel's voice, calm and measured, telling his truth. The outpouring was immense again, but this time different. A young man from Chicago wrote, "I used to think I had to get loud to be heard. You taught me that sometimes. The quietest voice carries the deepest truth." An elderly woman in Nebraska sent a letter saying, "You reminded me of my grandson. He died in police custody. I never got to see justice, but watching you, it gave me peace I didn't think I'd ever feel again." Daniel placed those messages in his box, which was now full. He bought a second one. He didn't become a celebrity, didn't go on talk shows, didn't run for office or write a book. But in quiet living rooms, in hushed classrooms, in whispered conversations between fathers and sons, his name carried weight, because he stood when standing meant shaking, because he kept showing up, first for himself, then for others, because the video didn't just show what happened to him. It showed what could happen to anyone. Daniel often walked by the courtroom where it all unfolded. The building hadn't changed, still gray, still cold. But now, when he passed it, he no longer felt small. He felt centered, grounded. He'd look up at the stone steps, remember the way his feet felt heavy that first day, how he almost didn't walk through those doors. And then he'd remember how it felt to walk out. Changed, not just by the verdict, but by the fact that he told the truth and the world listened, and in that memory there was power. One evening he sat with his niece in the park. She was 7, full of questions, full of wonder. She asked him, "Uncle Daniel, why do people do bad things to good people?" He looked at her for a moment, then replied, "Because sometimes they forget we're all people, but that's why we remind them." She smiled, satisfied, skipped ahead to play on the swings, and Daniel sat on that bench, the sun melting into the horizon, thinking not about the past but about what comes next, about how healing is not an event but a way of living, about how justice isn't a destination but a path, about how every moment of truth, spoken or shown, becomes a ripple, and ripples, when enough of them rise, become waves. He had once been a name on a docket, a face on a screen, a case number in a file. Now he was a reminder, a quiet revolution, a man who turned pain into purpose, not by shouting, not by fighting, but by standing still in truth. That's where real change begins. A few years later, the city built a community center named after someone else, a well-known philanthropist. But tucked into one of its side halls, they opened a room for public legal education. Know Your Rights workshops, community town halls, free legal aid consultations. On the wall near the entrance hung a small frame. Inside it, a still image from the courtroom video, Daniel, mid-sentence, not angry, not scared, just present. Below it, a plaque read, "Truth has a pulse. When you speak it, the world remembers how to listen." People came and went. Some didn't stop to read it. Some didn't know his name. That was okay. Daniel had never wanted to be famous. He wanted people to feel what he hadn't felt when he needed it most, seen. He still lived in the same neighborhood, still took walks early in the morning when the streets were quiet and the sun felt new. Sometimes a neighbor would nod and say, "Good morning, Mr. Davis." That was enough. One fall evening, he attended a panel on criminal justice reform at the university. He wasn't scheduled to speak. He sat in the back, content to observe. But midway through, the moderator mentioned his name. "We're honored to be joined tonight by someone whose case has become a cornerstone of modern accountability." The room turned. Daniel stood slowly, offered a quiet wave. The crowd clapped, not a roar, but the kind of applause that comes with knowing, with respect. During the Q&A, a law student asked, "Mr. Davis, do you believe the system can be fixed?" He didn't hesitate. "I don't think it's about fixing," he said. "I think it's about remembering. Systems are made of people, and people forget. They forget fairness, compassion, accountability. We remind them, and we keep reminding them until they remember. So well they teach the next generation how to remember, too." Another silence followed, not empty, full. Later, as he exited the building, that same student caught up with him. "I'm scared," she said. "I want to help people, but I'm afraid the system will change me more than I change it." Daniel smiled. "Then stay close to your why. Write it down. Tape it to your bathroom mirror. Keep it where fear can't reach." She nodded, eyes wide with understanding. And Daniel saw something in her, something fierce and focused, like a match about to light. He went home that night and opened his second box of letters, read a few old ones, then added a new note, scribbled in his own handwriting. The truth can be buried, beaten, bruised, but it cannot be erased. It waits for one voice, one moment, one video. He folded it carefully and placed it inside. Outside, the wind rustled the trees. Inside, Daniel sat still, a quiet man in a quiet house, carrying a story the world had once tried to ignore. But they couldn't. Because he didn't let them, because he showed up, because he believed. Even in the darkest moments, that light could still find its way in. And that belief, steady and stubborn, is what history is made of. The letter sat in the box, resting on the others like a final stone on a long path. Daniel leaned back in his chair, his hands folded across his chest. For the first time in years, he didn't feel the hum of tension beneath his skin. Just stillness. The house was silent, but it didn't feel empty. It felt full, of echoes, of memory, of things that mattered and refused to be erased, the kind of silence that follows truth when it's finally spoken. That night, Daniel slept without waking. No flickering scenes of courtrooms or cameras, just quiet. But the story didn't end there. Months later, a small podcast picked up Daniel's case. They interviewed old attorneys, one of the jurors, and even the officer who had once told Daniel he was wasting everyone's time. The officer, now retired, spoke haltingly but honestly. "I was wrong," he said. "I didn't see him. I saw a problem, and I walked right past the person." That episode went viral, not for scandal, but for truth, for growth, for what it meant to admit publicly that we're capable of missing what matters and brave enough to say so. Schools began using Daniel's trial in ethics curriculums, not as a case study in corruption, but in courage. His name didn't become a brand or a slogan. It became something quieter but stronger, a reminder. He never liked talking about legacy. But when asked once by a young reporter what he hoped people would remember, Daniel simply said that the smallest voice can change the biggest rooms. And in the end, that was all he ever wanted. Not fame, not revenge, just that the next time someone stood where he had once stood, they wouldn't have to stand alone. Years passed. His steps grew slower, his hair silvered. But his eyes, those steady, watchful eyes, never lost their focus. One day, while sitting on a park bench watching kids race bicycles down a cracked sidewalk, a boy approached him. 10, maybe 11 years old, a little shy, holding a notebook. "Are you Mr. Davis?" Daniel nodded. "My teacher told us about you. Said you stood up when it was hard, said you showed people what's right." Daniel smiled softly. "That was a long time ago," the boy shrugged. "Still matters." He sat beside him on the bench. Without asking, pulled out his notebook and began writing. Daniel watched him in silence, the corners of his mouth curling slightly. The wind picked up, rustling the leaves overhead, And in that small moment, quiet, unnoticed, without fanfare, Daniel Davis knew something with absolute certainty. History doesn't remember the noise, it remembers the truth. And truth, once spoken, never disappears. The boy scribbled something in his notebook, then paused, looking up at Daniel. "Do you think people listen now?" he asked. Daniel thought for a long moment before replying. "Some do. Some are just waiting to hear it the right way." The boy nodded slowly, then held out the notebook for Daniel to see. On the page, in careful, blocky handwriting, it read, "Stand up. Speak true. Someone's always listening." Daniel stared at the words, his throat tightening. It was so simple, so clear. The kind of clarity only young eyes can offer without trying. He handed the notebook back and patted the boy gently on the shoulder. "That's good," he said. "That's real good." The boy grinned, then hopped off the bench and ran back toward a waiting group of kids. As he disappeared into their laughter, Daniel sat still again, letting the moment settle deep into his chest. He didn't need applause. He didn't need headlines. He just needed to know that something he did helped someone else stand taller, speak louder, walk straighter. And in that moment, he felt it. It didn't matter if people forgot his name, because what he stood for, that stayed, that outlived him. Later, in his final years, a small group of law students asked if they could interview him for a documentary. He almost said no, but then he remembered the boy on the bench, the notebook, the question, and he said yes. The interview took place in his living room. No lights, no sets, just a small camera, a notepad, and questions asked with reverence. "Mr. Davis," one student began, "do you ever wish it hadn't happened? That you could have lived your life quietly without the pain, the fight, the exposure?" Daniel sat back, hands folded in his lap. Then he smiled, not bitter, but knowing. "If it hadn't happened, I wouldn't be who I am. And the world wouldn't be what it became after." They sat in silence for a moment. Then he added quietly, "I wouldn't wish it on anyone, but I wouldn't trade it either." When the documentary was released, small, student-made, it caught fire. Teachers played it in classrooms. Community leaders used it in training seminars. It wasn't flashy, but it was real. And real in a world often drowning in noise was enough to cut through. Near the end of the film, there's a shot of Daniel sitting alone on his porch, watching the sky shift from pink to purple. No words, just presence. Then, the screen fades to black and a final quote appears. "One voice once ignored can echo through generations." Daniel Davis passed peacefully 2 years later. No scandal, no spectacle, just peace. But the bench he once sat on, the city installed a plaque there. It reads, "He was beaten, he was silenced, but he rose, and the world heard him." Kids still pass it, sit on it, write on it, and sometimes, when no one is looking, whisper to themselves the words they remember from school. Truth, once spoken, never disappears. The seasons turned. The bench stayed. Visitors came and went, some knowing its history, others just seeking a quiet place to sit. But every so often, someone would run their fingers across the plaque. Some would pause to read it out loud. Others would close their eyes and sit in silence, as if listening for something carried by the wind. One afternoon, a young public defender named Maya stopped at the bench between court hearings. Her day had been heavy, clients unheard, cases dismissed before truth could find a voice. She sat down, exhausted. Her eyes drifted to the plaque. He was beaten, he was silenced, but he rose, and the world heard him. Something inside her shifted. She pulled out her phone and opened a note she'd written months ago, but had never dared to send. It was a resignation letter, but she didn't delete it. She added to it, "And yet, I remember why I came here. In the first place, it wasn't for the fight, it was for the people, for their truth." She saved the note, stood up, and walked back toward the courthouse, not with resolve, but with something deeper, remembrance. Elsewhere, a teacher in Detroit used Daniel's case to show students how law and conscience collide. One student, a quiet girl who rarely spoke, stood up at the end of class and said, if he could speak when no one wanted to hear him, then maybe I can say something too. In a coffee shop in Portland, a young filmmaker rewatched the documentary, tears in his eyes. Not for the pain, but for the perseverance. He later wrote a script inspired by Daniel's life. That script would win awards. But more importantly, it would change minds. And in a small-town library, a boy found a book titled Voices That Shape Justice. He flipped through and stopped on a chapter titled The Lawsuit That Laughed Back. There was Daniel's photo, calm, worn, steady. Below it, the final quote. They laughed at his claim until they heard the truth. That boy would grow up to become a civil rights attorney. Years from now, long after most had forgotten the fine details of the trial, the name Daniel Davis still lingered. Not in fame, not in textbooks, but in values, in voices refusing to go silent, in choices made under pressure to do nothing and choosing to speak instead. Because Daniel's story wasn't about the moment he won, it was about the 1,000 moments. He could have quit and didn't. The times he walked into rooms built to ignore him and stood still anyway. The nights he stared at ceilings wondering if it was worth it, and woke up ready to go again. That is what people remembered. That is what lasted. And when the world seemed too loud, too cruel, too fast, there remained one echo, gentle but insistent, in the hearts of those who knew his story. Truth, once spoken, never disappears. And so, the echo of Daniel's voice didn't just survive, it grew. In courtrooms where defense attorneys reminded juries to listen, not just with their ears, but with their conscience. In neighborhoods where parents taught their children that silence in the face of injustice is a form of surrender. In protest, chants that pulsed with something older than rage, something rooted in the patient belief that even when systems fail, truth does not. Years later, a podcast series would recount Daniel's story in vivid detail. Listeners from around the world wrote in, many confessing they had never questioned the power imbalance in their own legal systems until they heard his story. One listener, a retired judge, wrote anonymously, I once dismissed a case like Daniel's. I never forgot the look in the plaintiff's eyes. Thank you for reminding me what justice is supposed to feel like. A university named a lecture series after him. The Daniel Davis Forum on Courage and Civil Rights. The first keynote. Speaker, a formerly incarcerated activist, began his address by simply saying he didn't raise his voice. But he made the nation listen. And back in that quiet neighborhood, the park bench had begun to fade with time. The wood was weathered, the bolts a little rusted, but the plaque remained. Someone had polished it. People still came. A mother brought her son there one afternoon. He had just faced his first experience with discrimination at school. She held his hand, guided him to the bench, and told him Daniel's story. Not to fill him with anger, but to offer him perspective. Power. After she finished, her son asked, Did Daniel win? She paused, then answered, He didn't win a game. He changed the rules. That boy went home and wrote an essay titled My Voice Matters Too. It made it to the school district's monthly bulletin. His principal read it. So did parents across the city. Quietly, policies were reviewed, conversations began, because Daniel's fight hadn't ended with the verdict. It lived on through every person who saw themselves in his silence and found the courage to speak. It lived in the unglamorous moments, when someone chose to document abuse rather than look away, when someone stepped forward in a meeting and said, That's not right, even if it cost them comfort. And it lived in the steady insistence that no matter how small your voice may feel, when it carries truth, it echoes far beyond what you see.